When I was a child, one of my favourite games was The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Anyone who's played it can probably figure out why, even if they don't particularly find it their favourite. Naturally, as a very popular game, it spawned a lot of rumours and legends, especially back in the day when communication through the internet wasn't as common. Most of the legends are false, but sometimes a surprising amount of truth can be found in them. A while ago, I found an article about early versions of Zelda 3D, as it was called in development, and apparently those were the early days were incredibly different from the released version. It was modelled after the original Legend of Zelda rather than a link to the past, and as such was a lot more free-roaming and adventurous than the one we got. At the time it sounded awesome, and even I found myself wondering why they have abandoned the project. I concluded that it was probably due to the technical requirements of such a feat. Still, one thing can especially stuck with me than the pictures. Some were nondescript, nothing special, but one showed a large expansive desert environment. So I'm just going to put the picture up on screen now. There was a palm tree and a small oasis near a much more primitive looking Link, as well as some enemies. Past that, however, it was just sand, stretched into the horizon. The thoughts of what might lay out beyond the desert seemed to stick the image into my mind. After that, we skipped several years. The article was only vaguely recollection, nothing important. I was hanging out at the local game shop with one of my friends. He's telling me about this day, and tells me about how some guy came to him selling missing son's video games. He showed me them, and they're all normal games. A few Wii games, a few GameCube games, and a lot in Nintendo 64 games. Still, the only one that caught my eyes was a red cartridge with no label, except a piece of duct tape with the word Zelda? ? Written all over it in marker. Naturally, this got me curious. My friend didn't share my curiosity, but he didn't think he could sell the game and just let me take it home for free and indulge myself. Naturally, I did. The moment the game started, I realised it wasn't Zelda that I was used to. The title screen was nothing but a nondescript The Legend of Zelda. No subtitles, no fancy fonts, no music, just those words in black bolded lettering. The background wasn't from Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask either. It was overhead view of what we could be called an ancient ruins. They looked very sinister and similar to something from Majora's Mask, only with any hint of the mystical atmosphere that accompanied any Zelda game. They were simply unnerving. Still, this don't stop my curiosity, it only kept me going. As I pressed start, the game begun. It skips over the file screens and dumps a blocky looking Link into an empty black environment. And when I say black, I mean black. There was nothing separating the ground and sky, just blackness. The only thing that let me notice the game even worked was a temple in the desert, in the distance. Similar to the one in the opening, moving still seemed to work fine, suggesting that something probably glitched with the textures of the ground and sky. Still, it seemed strange that nothing happened to any of the other textures. Entering the temple was my only choice, so I took it. One thing that is worth mentioning is that the game started with no music, just a deathly silence. However, the closer you came to the temple, the more music was available to hear. Well, it wasn't really music, it sounded like moaning, similar to the Redeads in Ocarina of Time, but more tiny and badly recorded. Every once in a while, some sobs can be heard, but they were quickly stifled. Entering the temple made everything seem more like a Zelda game, but something caught my eyes. Rather than the textures being worse than those in Ocarina of Time, they were better. There were more detail in everything, but it was all dingy and rotten looking. Extra polygons only served to make things look more better. The random blood splatters didn't help eat anything either. It didn't take long for me to realise that the entire dungeon could hardly be called Legend of Zelda-like. Puzzles usually only consisted of pulling a lever or pressing a switch. In fact, there wasn't any sliding blocks. There was no enemies either, but the blood splattered on the walls served to be only warnings of booby traps. Some because inescapable and simply send you back to the darkness again, others are escapable, but extremely creepy and depressing. The dungeons were riddled with the low poly remains of dead adventures, and sometimes they even had items on them. The items could be picked up, but the inventory screen seemed unfinished, and the game's only auto-equipped the first 3 items picked up, since there was no accessible inventory screen. After several gruesome deaths and retries, I found my way to the door, marked with a scratched on eye. Similar to the ones in the Lens of Truth and various other objects, entering the door revealed a boss battle. The music by this point has changed, and I only realised it was by the last room. The moaning had never looped once, but still seemed to change according to the mood. A violin melody started playing, but the rest of the sound remained nothing but moans, sobs, yells, and weird scratching. It was never enough to rise past the level of background noise, but it still remained unnerving, almost as it wasn't music at all, but monsters that were wandering somewhere in the temple. When I said entering the room revealed a boss battle, I wasn't entirely honest. It could be called a boss battle by the most generous of standards. It features an empty room with the same textures on the wall as the rest of the temple. The only out of place aspect was a giant face on the other side of the room, coloured as grey as the wall surrounding it. Its skin seemed stretched over its head and lined with the walls, so it kind of looked like the walls growing a face. Moss seemed to be growing over its closed eyes, and the cracks were apparent everywhere on it. Still, the door I came in was locked, and the only thing I could really do was approach it, so I did. Carefully making sure there was nothing waiting for a surprise attack, I went up to the point where I was nearly in contact with the face. Nothing. It was still there, with its sunken eyes and cracked lips. I attacked with a sword. The sword went through and made an incredibly vulgar flesh-ripping sound, but nothing happened. It remained there. I attacked some more, and still more, and eventually the music stopped. Soon the violin music became even louder, and the moans started up even stronger, and something happened. In one movement, the eyes opened, staring at me with dry, soulless eyeballs, and then nothing. The music was still louder, but I continued to attack the face with no reaction, until it simply had enough, ripped to shreds and fell into a flyer. In typical Zelda fashion, revealing the door, the music had stopped, but there was no moans, no screams, anything. I went through the door. What a fool I was. That was only the tutorial. The screen was replaced by a white screen, followed by a moment of extremely loud browning noise. I jumped, but it was over it almost instantly. The white screen was replaced by an endless desert, the one from the image. I was in shock. By that point, I was creeped out enough to turn the game off. Still, that respite didn't last long. I had nightmares of the game. Normal nightmares, nothing weird about them. It was after all a pretty creepy game. However, what frightened me the most was something I skimmed over while I played after and realised afterwards. The game changed each time I started over. When I tried to take the game path through the labyrinth, I always ended up lost and confused. By that point, I finished, and I was reliant on instinct. I kept going the next day, stopping only to eat and go to the bathroom. When I turned it on, I was at the desert, even though there was no file screen. This time though, it was at night. I walked. Sometimes I would walk through 20 minutes at a time to only find a ruins that kind of looked somewhat like a village hut. Other times there would be a skull, maybe a few bones, but nothing more noticeable than that. Other times I would see great expanses of oases and troubled forests. There I found my first enemy. They were similar to Tectits, only with larger bodies, mostly contained in their larger eye. They had thin, long legs, and would sometimes even attack by leaping. Only when they hit you, they would pin you to the ground and attack. Soon the sun rose, and I constantly walking. Sometimes I would find small tombs. These were almost similar to the style of the first dungeon, only without the moaning and no bosses. What I did find was information, runes scribbled into the walls that could be read. The description would almost be vague, and phrases like, "and knowledge shall guide, ways to heavens." Sometimes they would be followed by other comments, but writing seemed glitched and unintelligible. It seemed to be history, though. The maps I would sometimes find confirmed it. I would simply explore, and after a while, I learned to let the instinct guide my way. So soon I would find the next dungeon, and large pyramids rising out of the desert, upside down. Over it, straight up to the sky, was a large upside down temple. It stretched so far I couldn't see the top, but I couldn't keep going. I needed to sleep again. The next day came, and I entered the dungeon. It was like small tombs I would find, only a bit more perilous. More bottomless pits, transoms, spike traps, and monsters this time. Long arms that would grab you from the wall, kind of like wall masters, only these were simply just threw you into the traps, instantly killing you. What probably used to be re-deads and skeletons at the time of this dungeon, I found a large spiral staircase. I followed it up, and up, until I reached what seemed to be the top. It took 2 hours of climbing, but this time it seemed to fly by. The top was merely a platform with a large arrow pointing off to the edge. Since there was nowhere else to go, I jumped. The screen again flashed white, and I was in a new area. This went on for a few weeks. There was many places to visit, and at the time I could find the borders where one local met another. I started to name the locations I've been to, but although I started knowing all the places immediately, there would never seem to be to the end of the new locations. Sometimes I would go through one door and come out the other side of the world. Places didn't behave by constant rules of space, but it became more easier to find my way regardless. Each time I revisited a place, it was rearranged in a different, more navigable setup. From every corner though, I could see the tower in the distance. I quickly realized that I had not reached the top, only fallen into one of my many traps. In fact, I still have never reached the top. In the few times I went about the real world, I could never feel that the game was different. It changed itself. It seemed to react to me. I was sure that the game was like it should have never been able to be created, but then there were going to be free roaming experiences more similar to the original Zelda. What if they succeeded? They created a world one could always roam, and they never really did create a world. I had learned of many gods in that land, the three goddesses who created such a perverted physical world, the god he who sees, who decided to cleanse it. I still don't know my own route, but I felt that I simply followed my instincts. I could find my goal. That's why I'm writing to this now. My instincts still tell me where to go, but it's not here. It's not in the game. I have not left, and I will do it. But before I go, I feel I need to leave this message for someone to find it. I should warn you though, it may be a game, but it knows you're playing.